Hello and welcome. I'm Tandy and this is Harlan and we're the Lost Boys and we are here with a set review for you from Chapter 2 of Disney's Lorcana, Rise of the Floodborn. And today we're going to be going over the color Sapphire. This is a color combination that is very much revolving around items. And Harlan, why don't you just tell us about the first card that we're going to be talking about, Popsicle, this one-cost item.
Yeah, so this card is the defining card of the color. I think it's the defining card of the set, and I think it's the defining card of the game of Lorcana. I don't know if how many of our viewers at home are from Magic the Gathering, like we are, but we had a very similar card printed a few years ago that got banned in every format down to Pauper, which is the commons only format, and this card is Popsicle. So it's a one-cost inkable item. Jumbo Pop. When you play this item, you may draw a card, and that's Redwood. Banish this item, remove up to 2 damage from chosen character. This card.
That second ability doesn't really do a lot, right? But the first ability, the draw card thing.
Funny enough, the second ability will come up with some of the other cards we do later in Sapphire that, pick up an item from your discard pile. So it is actually relevant that it can put itself in the discard pile so you can pick it up again to recur it and draw another card. But yeah, this card is just it's funny because I always say that the actions that cost 1 and draw a card are like kind of bad because you're just wasting the resource. This is, you are spending that ink, but you're actually investing it into a card on the table that you can do other things with. And we will see throughout this spoiler that there are so many cards that fundamentally do not work without this card in the set.
Yeah.
On top of this card is just kind of absurd because you are getting an item in play and already replacing it. And you have this additional resource that matters for your other cards. It's so absurd.
So one thing that I like talking about when we do discuss Magic, there are 2 types of items. We call them artifacts or enchantments. There are 2 types of items that are particularly problematic, and those are items that cost 0 so that you can play a bunch of them for free and then use them in a number of different ways, often exploiting different cards that push on different parts of the game engine. But there are also things that replace themselves, and the things that replace themselves very rarely have text on them that matters in the grand scheme of things, or like progressing towards physically winning the game, but they say draw a card on them, or sometimes do more than that. And Popsicle is a great example of the second of those 2 things, where it's just something that comes into play, replaces itself, and sits. And any of your other cards that you have that reference an item are now juiced. And so while it doesn't really do anything, it's statically doing stuff over the course of the rest of the game, slowly making every one of your item matters cards more powerful. Now, as we get into all the other Sapphire cards, we're going to be referencing Popsicle a lot. So make sure you just have this one locked in your head. 1 cost inkable item, comes in, draw a card, banish it, remove up to 2 damage from chosen character. All right, we're going to be starting off with the more expensive cards, as we've done in the last few videos, just because those are often the big shift characters that we want to talk about, whereas the smaller iterations are usually a little bit weaker. So we're going to be starting off here with Grand Pabby. This is a 7-cost uninkable, 3/6, the quest for 3. It's the oldest and wisest. It has Ancient Insight. Whenever you remove 1 or more damage from one of your characters, gain 2 lore. So we already see one thing that the second iteration, or the second ability on Popsicle works with Grand Pabby's heal effect.
Yeah, so this card actually is part of a combo deck that a friend of the channel, Jeebus, the streamer, who plays a good amount of Lorcana now, he has an awesome Ruby Sapphire combo deck that is built around Popsicle and all the ways to recur it and draw cards. And he actually just builds to a combo with Grand Pabby and a card like Scar from our last video, where that Scar readies whenever it challenges something.
Right.
And so it builds up damage very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And then you just recur Popsicle and you gain an absurd amount of lore. I've seen him gain 18 plus lore in a single turn.
Wow.
From basically no board. Like, he didn't have a bunch of characters that could quest. It was just 18 lore off of the Scar and the Pabby, just comboing off. It was crazy. And it does it pretty consistently because you draw so many cards.
I'm going to have to see that deck, so I'm going to be going and checking out Jeebus's Twitter after this to see if he posted up any of the lists. He was in the like top ranked players on Pixelborn for quite some time during the first season. I expect as long as he's playing the game, he will be up there in the running. He was an excellent streamer of Storybook Brawl, a game that I played tons of. And he actually even came out to the Lost Boys Invitational that was sponsored by TCG Player a few months back when we had it at the Apex Gaming Store back in October. Next up, we're going to be talking about Gaston, Intellectual Powerhouse. This is a 6-cost uninkable 4/4 that quests for 3, and it shifts for 4 with the ability Developed Brain. When you play this character, look at the top 3 cards of your deck. You may put 1 into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. So, draws a card basically when it comes into play, has a shift, quests for 3. I love this card. I already played it in one of our Versus videos when it was one of the first few cards revealed. And it worked nicely as a shift, and it also worked nicely just casting it. Felt very similar to Robin Hood Unrivaled Archer, except there was no downside of your opponent having to have more cards in hand than you. And being able to look at the top 3 often meant that I was able to find very specific answers to the problems you were presenting.
Yeah, another thing I want to go over, especially with types of cards like this Gaston, where this card, by all accounts, outside of being uninkable, is just kind of like a slam dunk auto include in almost any Sapphire deck, right? It's not only that it replaces itself, it gives you card selection. It's an awesome threat. It has 3 points of lore. The normal stats are fine. You know, it's a 4/4. It's going to survive. It's going to offer trades. It's a good card all around, right?
Mm-hmm.
This card is not something I'm even entertaining putting in any of my Sapphire decks at this point because of this Popsicle engine.
Okay, so it's not part of the Popsicle engine, so it's not making the cut. Okay.
It's overcosted for what it does because everything works with Popsicle and draws 1+ cards already. The issue Sapphire has at this point is not finding cards that draw cards. It's adequately impacting the board so that you aren't falling too far behind while all of your cards draw a billion cards.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm very excited about the Popsicle deck, so we'll continue discussing it as we move on to our next card, Basil. Great Mouse Detective, or is it Basil? Is it Basil or Basil?
Yeah, it depends on if you ask Gordon Ramsay or not.
That's a good one. This is a 6-cost inkable 3/4. It has shift 5. Shift 5 on a 6-drop is a pretty expensive shift. But let's continue. It quests for 3. And the ability is, there's always a chance. It says, if you use shift to play this character, you may draw 2 cards when he enters play, but doesn't have that effect when you cast it normally. So this is a shift or bust type of card, which is pretty cool, but maybe has the same problem as the Gaston we were just talking about.
Yeah, it's a weird time, especially with a second chapter of a game that, like, we've already hit this, like, well, this is kind of the busted thing. And I really don't want to harp on it too much, but it is very much a thing that exists and is a thing you have to be aware of. Mm-hmm. And, you know, that isn't always the most fun, but when you're more competitively focused, it matters. You know, if you're going to be going to a tournament and you're already going to be playing, if you choose to be playing a Sapphire deck, if you're playing a less powerful version of Sapphire, you're already at a disadvantage in your, you know, Sapphire mirror matches, but then everybody who is trying to beat Sapphire decks in general are equipped to beat the, you know, more powerful version. And, you know, it may be an unfun theme that you find across this video, but it is the world we live in.
Look, we talked a lot about Ruby and how the dealing yourself damage on your characters was like not that good thematically. Look, there's already a couple cards in the first set that work with items. Maurice, one of the bells, things like that.
Amatoa, yep.
Right. And so, look, that's just part of Sapphire's identity, but that doesn't mean that over the course of the next year, every single Sapphire deck is going to be a Popsicle deck. And if it does mean that, then there's a chance that they have to ban Popsicle just because it enables too many of these like kind of wonky item combos. And so yes, like you said, but I think it's important to think about these cards both in a vacuum and in current context. And something like that Basil or the Gaston are both going to be significantly stronger when the context of the Popsicle is removed, and that can be either naturally via metagame shifts or combinations that are derived in future sets, but it can also just mean that action is taken against the Popsicle, and then we have to reevaluate these cards with a different lens. I think both of them being able to draw cards or multiple cards is quite strong, and I think either would have been fine in your Amber Sapphire mid-range deck that you used to win the Invitational a few months back. And but now we're just moving in a different direction, and Popsicle is the direction that we want to move because we understand that it's probably going to be the most competitive Sapphire strategy.
And I do want to, it is unfun in general because it pushes out a lot of other cards that you want to play.
Don't say unfun. It's not. It's barely been out, and I haven't even gotten to play with it yet. Don't tell me what's fun and unfun yet. I want to try.
This is my personal feeling that it is less fun. That it feels like I have less cards to play with. But the upside is
I see.
That the Popsicle and all the cards that work with it are an absolute blast to play with. So it is, ultimately a win. It's just, I want to have my cake and eat it too, All
right. Well, moving on, we're going to talk about Rabbit Reluctant Host. This is a 5-cost inkable 4/6 that quests for 2. Just filling out the stats on the curve. This one's nothing really to talk about too much. Then we're going to see next up is Cruella de Vil, Perfectly Wretched, 5-cost inkable 4/3, quest for 2, and it has shift 3. The ability, oh, no you don't. When this character quests, chosen opposing character gets -2 strength this turn.
It's very strange to have this card next to the Queen from Amber. It's it's a very her versus the girl she tells you not to worry about.
Yeah, especially because there's like a goon that can be shifted on, and the shift only costs 2, and there's a million
versus 3. Yeah,
there's a million ways to compare. Not all cards and colors are created equal. I'll say that. So we are going to move on to probably my favorite card in Sapphire outside of the Popsicle stuff that I haven't really gotten to play with yet. We're going to talk about Cogsworth, Grandfather Clock, 5-cost inkable 2/5, quest for 2, and it has shift 3 as well as ward. And the ability is unwind. Your other characters gain resist 1. This is something that we played a little bit in our Versus series, and it was impressive. The ward meant you couldn't use Dragonfire on it, and if you never quested with it, it meant that all of your stuff perpetually had that resist 1, and there was very little your opponent could do about it.
Yeah, it's funny. This card hasn't seen as much play as we initially thought it would. I think partly because of, the whole Popsicle engine,
right?
But also partly because it almost kind of pushed itself out of the metagame almost immediately just by nature of if this is seeing play, things like Steel have to dial back and challenging gets way worse in general. So decks kind of slanted into a world where Cogsworth is kind of omnipresent, and that as a result makes the card itself worse because everybody is prepared for it, and then you almost don't need to play it because they're not doing the thing that it's strong against anyway.
Right. It dictates kind of where the format leads, and the place where it leads is a place where Cogsworth is not that useful, I guess. But we'll see. And I think the Popsicle thing is definitely going to be the deciding factor for many of these cards. But my initial testing with the Cogsworth, it felt really strong, and I would love to see some Cogsworth decks. If y'all have any, please share them down below in the comments. We'd like to see them. Next up, we're moving on to the 4-drops. This is going to be Sisu, Divine Water Dragon. This is from Ryan the Last Dragon. It's a 4-cost uninkable, 2/4 that quests for 2, and it has the ability, I trust you. When this character quests, look at the top 2 cards of your deck. You may put one into your hand, put the rest on the bottom of your deck in any order. So it replaces itself when it quests. The only real downside on this card, I think, is that it only has 2 strength instead of 3, which I think is more common for this cost, and it's not inkable. But once it comes down, it quests for a decent amount and replaces itself with a potentially better card. I quite like Sisu.
Yeah, this card is awesome. I think this card has a bright future. It being uninkable is not too big of a deal. And, it replacing itself almost immediately, it's not likely that this is going to get removed in a lot of situations. You're going to get to quest with it. And the slight selection on the ability, it's not just draw a card, makes it even more powerful. Mm-hmm. And, we've obviously talked a lot about Popsicle so far and the Popsicle engine and everything with it. You can dial all that back and play more of these fair cards like Sisu and Gaston and have kind of split your differences, which gives you some resiliency. You know what I mean? Where you aren't just all in on one thing. You're kind of hedging your bets in both directions with just a more robust game plan of all your cards are good. And this is a great card for doing that.
All right, next up, we're going to talk about Sardine Can. This is the second item we've seen outside of Popsicle. It's a 4-cost inkable item with the ability Flight Cabin. Your exerted characters gain ward. What?
Yeah, so it's strange because you actually want your unexerted characters to have ward.
Right. Because
your exerted characters can be challenged. I think it would be too good if it was just all your characters had ward, especially when it's not a character itself. That being said, I think it kind of misses the mark of it's good if your opponent is all in on, focus targeting your things. But if they have a good mix of challenging and targeting like they should, it's going to be pretty weak overall, especially at 4 cost. But, there might be a world where there's a deck that's just like, I'm going to blow up all your stuff with targeted removal, and I don't really have good challenges, but I don't really see that being a thing.
I would be surprised if this card ever sees play in a constructed deck. I think this card is extremely weak, and I don't really get it. I think this card could cost 1. I don't know. I just don't think it does much. Okay, moving on, we're going to be discussing 4 Dozen Eggs. This is the song from Beauty and the Beast that Gaston sings about his eating habits. 4-cost inkable song says your characters gain resist 2 until the start of your next turn. So the turn you play it, you may do some challenging to get immediate resist, but then also your stuff maintains that resist until until the end of your opponent's next turn when they start to challenge your stuff. What do you think about 4 Dozen Eggs and that big damage buffer?
Yeah, I could see 1 or 2 of this seeing play in decks, kind of like my ramp deck from the Invitational, where a lot of the games come down to kind of board stalls, especially against steel decks where they kind of need to build to double grab your sword turns, where you can just absolutely blow them out just on a turn where you're like, okay, I'll 4 Dozen Eggs and quest with everything and present lethal on my next turn. And then everything with resist 2 against a grab your sword deck, it doesn't matter if they have double grab because both of them do 0 damage to all your things. So it can be a way to kind of immediately close the game against steel decks. Mm-hmm. In decks that, specifically play to the board with kind of not necessarily wide, but also not necessarily super tall, a good mix where you just play largely to the board, like that ramp deck. You could find a home for this because it's inkable in the matchups where it's not good, or if you draw it early, you just ink it.
All right, so the next card we're going to be discussing is Falling Down the Rabbit Hole. This is an action that's not a song, so it costs full retail. This is a 4-cost uninkable action. It says each player chooses one of their characters and puts them into their inkwell face down and exerted. So if I have no character in play, I don't have to do it. But if I do have a character in play, I can choose my weakest one and it becomes ink. And I can also kind of deal with one of my opponent's characters. It seems like on the cusp of maybe being playable, but it just seems like a little too wonky to me.
Yeah, it is. It's hard to engineer a scenario where you really want to be doing this. The ideal is that you're, you played a Mickey Mouse detective on 3, and then you play this on 4, and you get to eat one of your opponent's characters and put your Mickey into your inkwell also. The hard part is that then you aren't doing something like playing Carefree Surfer in your deck, because you need to be building up your characters.
Right.
So then you're maybe more of like a Ruby deck where, you're more be prepared based and single targeted removal based. But then this is also really bad against a go wide strategy, which is kind of what you already struggle with outside of be prepared. So there's a lot of tensions on this card that I don't know if it's going to find a home, but if it has a home, it's going to be really good. Where like if somebody's just playing a deck where they play one big threat every turn, this card's basically phenomenal against those decks.
Right. I agree. All right. Before we move on, I'd like to take this time to say thank you to our sponsor, Games and Comics Paradise. Games and Comics Paradise is a store out of Fairfax, Virginia that specializes in trading card games like Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh!, Magic the Gathering, and now Disney's Lorcana. Make sure to check out their website, gcparadise.com, for all your singles and TCG needs. We will be looking forward to some tournaments that they have in the future. And Harlan, you're actually pretty close to their store, and hopefully you'll be heading up there to play some, so y'all can maybe meet Mr. Harlan at one of those events. All right, next up, we're going to be moving on to the Knock. This is the Water Spirit, the Knock. This is a 4-cost inkable 4/3 with Ward and a Quest for 1. Pretty generic.
Yeah, it's the problem with the Ward cards is you typically want them to be pretty high lore cards, because the idea is against the single targeted removal decks, you get to play your thing that's going to guaranteed translate to lore, because it can't be challenged and it can't be targeted. But, the 1 point of lore, I think, is going to hold this back a lot more than if it was like a 2/3 with 2 points or something,
I agree. Next up, we have Prince Charming, Heir to the Throne. This is a 4-cost inkable 3/3, the Quest for 3. Look like another Hans, but in a different color, yeah?
Yeah, it's funny because Sapphire as a color is so much less aggressive than Emerald that this card doesn't stand out to me. It's not like, oh my god, this fits in perfect, I can have a huge threat at this place on the curve. That's not really what I'm trying to do in my Sapphire decks.
No, I agree. I do like, basically spreading out the ability to get aggressive with cards like Prince Charming, Heir to the Throne. And, even the 2-cost Aurora, the Quest for 2, I think that there's a lot to be said about potentially building a Sapphire deck to work in that manner. We will need more pieces, but in the future, stuff like this existing gives me, some hope that we'll be able to do that. Next up, Nick Wild, Wily Fox. This is a 4-cost inkable 2/4, the Quest for 2. The ability, it's called a Hustle. When you play this character, you may return an item card named Popsicle from your discard to your hand. Tell me about it.
Well, Nick kind of already tells us everything we need to know with the flavor text. It's criminal how good these things taste.
I forgot. What were they made of? What was the Hustle? Because I've actually watched this movie, but it was like on a plane 8 years ago or 6 years ago or whatever. I remember it's just popsicles, but they're like shaped like a paw. But like, what is it made from? Like, why is it a Hustle?
I think it was a Hustle because it's like something he got for free, if I remember correctly. And then he like, people are like, why is this $2? And then he's like, the sticks are redwood.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, and it's just like random stuff, and like it's frozen, and then he just sells it for $2.
All right, fair enough. All right, but in the context of Lorcana, this card bringing back the Popsicle just means that if you play a deck with 4 Popsicle, this is essentially bring it back, which is essentially draw a card. On top of that, you can use it to heal him. Since he does have 4 willpower, it's quite high. So you can use the Popsicle to give him a little bit more willpower after he's been trading or getting tapped into. It's great in multiples. It is not good if you don't have a Popsicle already in your discard pile, I think is the big deal.
That's true, but it is inkable. And also it is as a card, a 2/4 2-point quester for 4 is actually like a reasonable card that, a lot of decks would be pretty close to playing. Obviously, you'd like better stats, but it's not anemic, or too anemic. It is a pretty functional card on rate on the curve in a spot that traditionally is kind of lacking in that 4-drop role. So it kind of fits in nicely.
Next up is Mrs. Judson. This is a 4-cost 1/5 uninkable, a quest for 2 with the ability Tidy Up. Whenever you play a Floodborn character, you may put the top card of your deck into your inkwell face down and exerted. So another potential ramper card for Sapphire, leaning into their kind of second identity outside of the items, is ramping.
Yeah, this card has some strong potential. It is where it fits on the curve, and then it needs a follow-up. It's really less about maybe ramping versus just like going really big. It's not necessarily about just getting there quickly. It's about just going large for those mid games.
Next up is James Role Model. This is a 4-cost uninkable 3/3. The quest for 2. The ability is Never Ever Lose Sight. When this character is banished, you may put this card into your inkwell face down and exerted. This is like a slightly bigger Grammatala. And Grammatala, it had some trouble, I think, seeing play early on, but ultimately even you ended up putting it in your winning Sapphire Amber deck and having a slightly bigger one that quests for a little bit more, and it's sized a little bit better. What do you think about this card?
Yeah, I could easily see playing a copy of this. If ever I was light on uninkables, which, that basically never happens ever because there's so many good uninkable cards. But this is if you have a couple slots, it's pretty easy to throw these in. Usually the issue with like these 4-drops is that they don't translate to enough value, but getting the lore or the trade out of this and then getting a resource back is a pretty big deal.
I like that it goes into your inkwell no matter how it is banished, and there are some cards that only work when they're banished in combat, and there are some that work whenever. The fact that this works whenever means that it's always going to be questing for 2 and then getting you an extra resource, which I think is pretty sweet. Next up is Hiram Flaversham. This is the toy maker. It's a 4-cost inkable 1/6. The ability is Artificer. It says when you play this character and whenever he quests, you may banish one of your items to draw 2 cards, and it quests for 1. Tell me about it.
Yeah, this is one of your largest payoffs for your popsicles, right? They are just always lying around unless you really needed to cash them in for healing, but we all know that healing isn't like a huge thing and it really doesn't come up. So typically they're just sitting around, and they immediately get translated into an additional 2 cards on a 4-cost 1/6, which is just, we've seen Rapunzel a lot, and a 1/6 is just even a little bit harder to get off the table.
Yeah.
And, this isn't as large of a threat because it doesn't have that second point of lore, but this threatens to draw even more cards than a Rapunzel can, and then some.
Yeah. And if you have enough cheap things to play out all of your extra resources that you can generate, it starts to become overwhelming for your opponent. The way that we constructed the Amber Steel Stitch Blitz deck at the beginning, for example, we play just an enormous number of 1-cost things so that when we start singing A Whole New World, we can deploy all of those extra resources before our opponent's able to deploy all of their resources, effectively overwhelming them. And I could really see Hiram doing something very similar. I love that it triggers when it comes in and when it quests, so you get to play it on 4 and immediately draw the 2 cards and kind of set up for your next turn. And it curves nicely with Nick Wild, where on turn 5 you can play Nick Wild, get back the popsicle, play the popsicle, draw a card, quest with Hiram, draw 2 cards, sack the popsicle again, and just keeps the juice coming and coming and coming.
You see what I was talking about earlier now?
Oh, yeah. Loving it. All right. So huge part of that combo is Hiram. Let's go to the next card. This is going to be a new version of Basil, Perceptive Investigator. There's a 4-cost inkable 3/4 that quests for 2. Nothing really special about this one. Maybe it's a shift
best
target.
thing it does is it gets shifted on top of while being a reasonable body itself. It's a bit of a cost to get that 2 cards back. it's less hoops because it's just, playing a character and then playing another character than this whole popsicle thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it in the amount of time you invest in it is so much worse than, you're paying 9 to get 2 cards out and you end up with 1 character where, with the popsicle, you've paid 1. If you play a Hiram, you're in for 5. You've already drawn 3 cards. It is a little bit more hoops to jump through, but the payoff, like the juice, is absolutely worth the squeeze.
All right, moving on. We're going to get to the 3 drops now. We're going to start with maybe my favorite color in Sapphire, and this is completely separate from all the popsicle stuff going on, but it might just be a good enough card to fit in the popsicle decks herself. This is Alice, Growing Girl, 3-cost inkable 1/4, and it says your other characters gain support. That's all of your other characters. And the bigger you build your board, the more powerful it can become because it allows for different combinations of some characters supporting others to allow for bigger and better trades. But it has an enormous payoff called What Did I Do? And it said, while this character has 10 strength or more, she can quest for +4 lore, so all the way up to 5. As far as I can tell, this is the most lore that a single character can generate by itself. And in conjunction with good advice or first ability that gives everything support, it doesn't seem that difficult to actually make Alice quest for 5 the turn after you play it, as long as you just have developed on turns 1, 2, and 4. Or if you play Alice later in the game, you can kind of just get it to a spot where you get to double spell on a turn with Alice, do some cool attacks, and then on the next turn maybe still quest for 5.
Yeah, this card is awesome. It's super flavorful. It's a sweet build around.
Yeah.
But also just, kind of strong in its own right without being like doing the whole thing to get to the 10 strength, but then also as the payoff. I expect to see a ton of this card. I don't think it's like gangbuster super strong, but I think it is a very solid card and does have a pretty high power level, and we'll definitely see a lot of it. So I expect to see the What Did I Do ability happen a couple of times, but I don't expect to see it super frequently.
I mean, look, you played, was it Bellstrange with Special? We thought it was going to be one of the best cards in the set. It kind of flopped in the first couple of weeks, but then after people really figured out how to build the Sapphire decks correctly, it started to pick up a little more steam in your Amber and Sapphire builds that you played at the Invitational. And I think that this card is easier to enable than that. Mostly because the way that I watched the games play from the commentary booth over the course of that weekend, the better players just stopped questing. And the more that you build up your board, the more that this card is going to be good. And if you're able to play a very similar game plan to that, I just think that it's going to be paltry to get it up to 10 strength. I mean, 3 characters most of the time, maybe even 2 characters, depending on how late in the game it is. That's like when you were going for the big finale, right? You're just going to go quest with this, quest with this, quest with this, all of them giving support to the Alice, quest for 5 more with Alice. And if everything starts ready, it's so difficult for some decks to even be in the race, right? And the same way that Bellstrange with Special is able to turn the corner and just obliterate your opponent on that regard. So
I do think there's a bit of a difference. Well, I guess Alice still meets the same requirement of she is enabling something else in the mid game.
Right.
And if it's something that you are really looking for is like, I really need support on these characters so I can get some good challenges in. And she has a pretty high willpower herself. So, she can be the challenger while you're doing that. And if, she falls off, that's totally fine because she's not going to be super relevant until way later in the game. And then you can just play another one at that point. Where, Bell was really meeting that we really wanted that being able to ink an extra thing.
Right.
And then it being inkable for when you didn't want that. Alice does meet all those requirements. So you might just be right that, it's like the early weeks where we don't really know how to do it. So we think it's kind of bad. And then we figure it out and it's actually really good.
My big draw for it is that it is one of the few cards that can do a support style thing with immediacy. Most of the other characters that have support, you have to play them, and then the next turn you have to quest with them, and then you already have to have something else in play to give the buff to, and your opponent has to have something vulnerable to be challenged. And so it just takes a lot of it's like a telegraphed play, and this is not a telegraphed play. Very similar to the Amber Queen that shifts, and I just love it. I maybe Sapphire just doesn't go in that direction. That's fine.
No, I think that's a really important thing to point out. It's like pseudo rush almost.
Yeah.
Where like it is slightly face up because the character that is going to be doing the supporting already had the challenge available to it. But if it's something that has like a high strength and a low willpower, that like your opponent was totally fine with the trade, and then you have something, say like a Rapunzel or whatever sitting around that's a 1/5, now you get to eat their thing and just have a meager amount of damage on your Rapunzel. That sounds great to me.
Now, to continue in the vein of all the support and things like that, what about Sapphire Amber coming back with the Queen, being able to juice up this card on top of, adding... So, like, the Queen says whenever it quests, it adds, 4 strength to your thing, -4 strength to your opponent's thing, but it doesn't say support. And so it kind of gains double support with that Alice, which is kind of messed up too, which means that it alone can add 8 strength to that Alice, which means that you only need 1 more strength to be able to quest for 5.
And the Amber cards just keep getting more busted.
I mean, look, we played the good
we
cards,
did that one
right?
first, since we keep talking about the Queen in every video.
Yeah, that's true. By design. Next up, we're going to be talking about Maurice's Workshop, another potential item for the item combo deck. This is a 3-cost uninkable item with the ability, looking for this. Whenever you play another item, you may pay 1 to draw a card. What do you think about this one in the items deck?
Yeah, so this is a really powerful engine that you have access to, especially when you're recurring the popsicles. This is kind of where you start to lose me a bit on what happens when you don't have popsicle?
Right.
This is a little bit far for me because it's 3 cost, which is already kind of high to not be doing anything, especially when your whole deck is just characters that are a little bit below rate and draw cards. So you need to be like impacting the board when you're not doing that. And this is more of the, air kind of in essence. And then it's also uninkable. So like when you don't have the popsicle, you can't even make this into an ink to keep doing whatever else you need to do.
Yeah.
Where the characters are inkable. And so this is where you really start to lose me. And, where it's like, okay, this is too much. Let me just do something else that maybe impacts the board. Or if I need more card draw, I'll just play something like Sisu,
No, I feel you. I'm not a big fan of that card either. Moving on, we're going to talk about Fang Crossbow. This is another item. Cost 3, is inkable. First ability is Careful Aim. Exert it and pay 2. Chosen character gets -2 strength this turn. Pretty weak ability, all things considered, especially costing 2 ink to activate. And then a second ability called Stay Back. You may exert it and banish this item to banish chosen dragon character. There's not that many dragons in Chapter 1, but there's a couple in Chapter 2, and now this might actually have enough targets to be viable, especially considering it's inkable, unlike the one from the first set that only killed dragons, but was not inkable.
Yeah, absolutely. If we end up with a dragon that is all over the place in so many matchups, you might see some play as a 1 or 2 of where, it's kind of a free roll because it's inkable. You'll never draw 2 if you only have 1 in your deck. Totally fine. Or if we ever get, sideboards added as we have more and more card pool, then, this is a solid sideboard card because it comes in the matchup where it's good. And then when they don't have the dragon, you just ink it. It's like the ideal in that type of scenario.
All right, next up, we're going to talk about Launch. This is a 3-cost action that's not inkable. Says banish chosen item of yours to deal 5 damage to chosen character. This is a perfect thing to use with Popsicle, if you have to ask me.
Ready, aim,
coconut?
Yeah, this card's sweet. I think this is also a bit, maybe a step too far. If we find more items that we kind of free roll, like I don't expect more things like Popsicle, where we're just automatically replacing it for the 1-cost investment, but this is the type of card that is what makes that problematic, that you already got your resource back. Like we talked about it with the song that, you discard one of your characters to blow up their character. This is like the same thing, but I was looking at a 3-cost character that drew a card. You're looking at 1-cost things that don't draw a card. For an item, we get both. We get the best of both worlds.
To be frank, it's not a song, so I don't know if it has quite the staying power as the other one. But that synergy with Popsicle and dealing 5 means it's going to kill most things in the game. I think that it's pretty solid. The only thing holding it back for me is it's uninkable, and that could cause some tension. But that's just a number of cards in your deck that you always have to be cognizant of. And I think as long as you have 44-ish inkables, I think you're going to be fine. And it can be part of the 14, or 16, or however many. Next up, Winnie the Pooh, Having a Think, 3-cost 2/3 inkable, and it quests for 2. With the ability Honeypot, whenever this character quests, you may put a card from your hand into your inkwell face down. I'll say that it started as being compared to Mickey Mouse Detective, people saying that this was better than Detective. I think it's significantly worse than Detective because the Detective gets a ink from the top of your deck and doesn't take something from your hand, where playing both actually just seems more reasonable than anything, if you ask me.
Yeah, I've had a ton of people reach out to me asking, if this would go in the Sapphire Amber ramp deck. And similarly to the Mickey comparison, this card is actually way closer to Fishbone Quill, which I would say is a better card because you get to make the resource immediately. And that is a card I'm not even a little bit interested in the ramp deck because it is card disadvantaged to be ramping, which is already an issue I kind of have with Belle, like a little bit, where I don't always want to be doing that with Belle. Like Belle was kind of there to specifically for when my opponent was going to be whole new worlding me to basically like, okay, I have a Belle. Do you really want to do it? Because I'm going to play 2 ink a turn and you're going to fall way far behind very quickly. Where, this does the same kind of thing, but way less powerful, where I can't do it immediately. I have to be questing with it, so I have to, untap with it. And then it's not repeatable and it doesn't threaten to gain 5 lore at the end of the game. I think this card is sweet. I think it's just, it doesn't have a home yet. And I think you have to be drawing a lot of cards. And then you kind of need more than just Fishbone Quill, right? You want to be playing more than 4 copies of that to want to play this.
All right, next up, we're going to be discussing Judy Hopps, Optimistic Officer. 3-cost inkable 2/3, quest for 2, with the ability Don't Call Me Cute. When you play this character, you may banish chosen item. Its player draws a card.
Yeah, so this is the card that really sends the Popsicle thing for me over the edge. Where this is a card I would want to be playing anyway because it's incidental item hate, right? Against your opponent that, I want item removal in my Sapphire deck. I don't have access to that. This is a 3-cost 2/3 that quests for 2. That's a pretty good stat line. I'm all for this. Oh, wait, I can blow up my Popsicle that already drew a card to draw a card? That's awesome. Now my situational card that I would, need to ink some amount of the time because my opponent doesn't have an item, it just drew a card instead and killed my item that didn't need to do anything. And I'll wild it back the next turn.
Yeah, love it.
It's great.
Next up, we're going to be discussing Caterpillar, Calm and Collected. This is a 3-cost inkable 1/3 that quests for 3. Give me your hottest take on this card.
Well, so the flavor text is keep your tempo, and that's what's going to happen with this card all the time because you're not going to be able to quest with it because they're going to challenge it immediately.
All right. Yeah, I mean, look, it's a 1/3, it's small body, but a 3-cost card that quests for 3. We don't see that a lot. And it seems like maybe they're trying to push Sapphire in a direction where they can potentially be a little more aggressive. We saw the Prince earlier that can quest for 3, and the Aurora that quests for 2 that only costs 2. And hopefully we'll just get closer and closer to having a Sapphire deck that kind of looks like the Emerald decks that we had in Chapter 1, right?
Yeah, I think it's important to point out that they're good with resist. Right, like Cogsworth and things like that. You give these characters resist, so maybe they aren't meant to quest immediately, but you get to like play 2 of them and then play the Cogsworth and then you get to quest because you have that resist now.
Sure.
And it's kind of like a delayed action, which is much more appealing to me. But it's kind of building a house of cards, and that's something I usually try and avoid.
I feel that. Next up is another item that potentially goes into these item combo decks. We're going to talk about Gumbo Pot, 2-cost inkable. The ability, the best I've ever tasted. You can exert it to remove 1 damage from each of up to 2 chosen characters. The ability doesn't seem that relevant. Is this something that maybe you want because it's just a cheap item?
Yeah, so Jeebus plays some of these in his deck, and it does remove damage from characters, so it combos with the 7-drop we looked at before to gain all that lore. And then it also works as a cheap item. I think this is another part of we might be digging a little too deep for me.
Right.
I want to find items I would be playing anyway.
Yes.
To pair with my popsicles, not a like third layer. It has some synergies like really far down once I've drawn a billion cards to turn on my cards. I think we can do better than this.
All right, next up is Noi Orphan Thief. This is a 2-cost inkable 1/2 with the ability Hide and Seek. While you have an item in play, this character gains Resist 1 and Ward, and a quest for 2. So this is another one of those very aggressive 2-drops that quest for 2. Has a couple of ways to potentially protect itself, but those types of decks don't usually like to play items because it takes away from that aggressively slanted game plan. But is Resist 1 and Ward enough to warrant playing Noi in something like your Popsicle deck?
Yeah, so this is a card that I see as kind of like a role player for attacking more of like a controlling deck, where you can get it down early after you played your Popsicle on 1, and then it just threatens to kind of dominate the lore totals for quite a while early in the game, where you really need to have 3 points of power of strength to be challenging this. Otherwise, you have to challenge over 2 turns, and then I've gained a bunch of lore. Or it has ward, so they can't Dragonfire it, right? But a lot of times I would expect this to be inked. And that's largely what it would be doing most of the time. I think it's a solid card that we'll see a lot of, but it probably won't hit play as often as you would think.
All right, continuing on with some more aggressively costed questers. This is Duke Weaselton, Small Time Crook, 2-cost inkable 1/2, the quest for 2, and it has ward. So kind of similar to Noi that we just saw, but doesn't require having an item in play, but no chance at the damage prevention ability to resist.
Yeah, I think this is it fits the same role where you have access to this in your Sapphire decks, and if you're not playing Popsicle or you'd rather not jump through the hoop, you have easy access to just, hey, this has ward. They're not going to be challenging me anyway. Let me get this early threat in and get some lore.
All right, next up, Cruella de Vil, Fashionable Cruiser, 2-cost inkable 3/2 with the ability, now get going. During your turn, this character gains Evasive and a quest for 1. So it can beat up on Simba, and it can beat up on Pascal and a number of other evasive characters. I think that this is maybe the best 2-drop in Sapphire. What do you think?
Absolutely. So this is, we've talked about the other 2-cost 3/2s that are inkable in the other colors that, I would play most of them just because sometimes it comes up that you want to eat a Simba. This is a card that I will absolutely be playing in the vast majority of my Sapphire decks because evasive is a keyword that you struggle with anyway in Sapphire, especially like a thing like Pascal, that it is so resource negative to be playing like a Let It Go on a Pascal that you can't remove otherwise. It's like
have you ever played a Dragonfire on a Pascal? I know you've played a Let It Go on a Pascal. They feel equally horrible.
No, mine feels worse because they get the resource back.
That's fair. That's fair.
Yeah, and the worst part is I can't even ink it because I know I have to kill the Pascal with it later. Yeah, that's horrible. Sapphire didn't have a good way to beat a Simba Protective Cub. Like, people say you had Phil, but we didn't have a good way to
Phil just gets squished by the deal 1 everything, Tinkerbell, or, it's whatever.
Yeah, and Cruella still gets Grab Your Sorted, but it does it way more functionally and translates to other matchups too. Yeah. And this card, it shores up a big issue that this color had moving forward.
All right, next up is the small version of the Cogsworth Talking Clock. This is a 2-cost inkable 2/3 with the ability, wait a minute, your characters with Reckless gain exert to gain a lore and a quest for 1. This is not really that relevant of an ability, but it is the shift target for the 5-cost Cogsworth Grandfather Clock. And when I played both of them in my deck, the 2-cost 2/3 was reasonable enough, and then the shift onto it was quite nice as well. What do you think about this? Do you think that Cogsworth package is going to see any play in Sapphire outside of the popsicle decks?
I do. I think this Cogsworth actually got a huge boost with the Ruby 1-drop cat, the 3/1 with Reckless. I think that makes this ability way more relevant, which increases this card's playability a lot, because I don't really think you need to be shifting big Cogsworth. I think that's more of like an incidental, hey, I was already playing the small one, let me shift it. Where now I think this Talking Clock Cogsworth actually will see some play in Ruby Sapphire decks.
All right, moving on. Basil of Baker Street. This is a 2-cost inkable 2/2. Quest for 1 and has support. This is a nice shift target for the 5-drop or the 6-drop Basil that shifts for 5. Other than that, I think this is a pretty whatever card. I mean, it's Phil-esque because of the support. Not vulnerable to the 1 damage stuff. We're going to be moving on to the 1-cost things now. We've already discussed Popsicle at length, so I'm going to skip over it, but just know it is in the 1-drop slot as well. We're going to be talking about Nothing to Hide. This is a 1-cost inkable action, and it says each opponent reveals their hand and you draw a card.
Yeah, so I think this card is important to have access to for the decks that really need actions to be turning your cards on. That being said, in most Sapphire decks, I expect this to not be seeing a lot of play in your kind of traditional game plans, because Sapphire as a color is already playing from behind a lot of the times, right? You're investing your time into ramping to do a bigger thing, so then you're not going to have an ink laying around, right? The whole point is curving up. So you're usually not going to have an ink just sitting around not being used for a turn. So this card I see seeing play later on once we have more payoffs like Pete Bad Guy and the Diver Minnie Mouse.
Yeah, I agree. When the first set came out, Develop Your Brain was a 4 of in like every Sapphire deck I saw, and I saw people playing it on turn 1 all the time, and I just told them to stop doing that. I said, just play it as ink, play something that affects the board, play Goon, play something else. Obviously later in the game, it's going to be significantly stronger because it has a little bit of card selection. This card, I don't really know what turn it's going to be actively good. Maybe turn 4 or 5, so that you just to like fill out using all of your ink for a turn, because it allows you to see your opponent's next couple of plays. And if one of those plays happens to be grab your sword, be prepared, Tinkerbell Giant Fairy, these things that are extremely effective on the board, maybe that knowledge is able to save you down the line. But overall, I think it's just a pretty generic card.
Yeah, the real problem with that is that those turns are the key turns to not be wasting an ink, right? You really need to be playing a 4 or 5 drop to match your opponents, to stay even on board. And, the information is helpful, but playing a 4 drop when your opponent played a 5 drop, that's a huge difference in this game. Especially when you start looking at the difference between the average 5 drop and the average 4 drop, those stats do not match up.
No, I agree. Well. That's a great point. Next up, we're getting down to the bottom of the barrel here. This is Owl, Logical Lecturer, 1-cost inkable 2/2, quest for 1. This is another Goon. Did we need another Goon? I think Flounder's got something to say about this one.
Yeah, Flounder's way more likely to get a shift card too.
I agree. I hope that they make like a giant Flounder that's like enchanted to be large and in charge. Maybe like Flounder gets turned into a shark, and it's like Flounder the shark gets shifted onto baby Flounder. That'd be sweet. All right, this is the last card of Sapphire and of today's video. This is Jasmine, Heir of Agrabah, a 1-cost inkable 1/2, the quest for 1, with the ability, I'm a fast learner. When you play this character, remove up to 1 damage from chosen character of yours. Pretty not...
Yeah, I could maybe see a world where this is a it finds a home in one of the Rapunzel decks that cares about you peeling damage off your cards. The problem being that, like, of course, Popsicle does that too.
Right.
So yeah, I don't see this finding much of a home. Maybe if we get a really aggressive Shift Jasmine, this could find a home just by enabling that. But yeah, don't expect to see this one very often.
Well, that's going to be the end of today's video. This has been our Lost Boys set review for Sapphire from Chapter 2 of Disney's Lorcana, Rise of the Floodborn. I'm Tandy. That's Harlan. Say bye, Harlan.
Bye, Harlan.